مرحبا طارق، كيفك؟
تمام تمام منيح. كيفك انت؟
أنا منيح، ماشي الحال. As we keep saying, considering يعني it's the universal caveat these days. طارق, I am very happy and excited to host you. You are one of the people who escaped me for a year, بس it didn't really escape me because I see you everywhere. And every time I see you everywhere, I feel bad getting in touch with you to come on. So, but this time we were able to يعني to pin you down. So very
بالعكس,
happy
it's my
that you're with
pleasure.
us, Habibi. And we are looking forward to your contributions to this What Have We Learned series, and the five topics that you have suggested or chosen are Israel, Gaza, resistance, and then the fourth one is a lot of things: apartheid, military occupation, settler colonialism, and then the fifth one is Hamas, on which you have written extensively. And a lot of people would like to hear from you about this. So, this last one, if you go over 5 minutes, I think everyone will forgive you. So, we'll start with a very quick question. And as I share with everyone, all of the biomaterial and the background stuff will be in the post. So, we're not going to do that kind of thing. So, let me start by first asking you, where do you think we are in this moment right now? And in full disclosure, this is October 21st.
Well, I mean, we're in a very frightening moment. It's as you and I were speaking just before we started this. There's almost this belief that we're more than a year into a genocide that hasn't abated, and the intensity of which is escalating. The horrors that we're seeing coming out of Gaza are really mind-boggling. That we're still in this space and still witnessing this, and nothing is changing. I think we're in a very dangerous period because a few things are happening. I mean, the genocide is ongoing, but it's no longer the only thing that is happening in the region. We obviously have an escalation of violence in the West Bank by armed settlers against Palestinians. We have invasions and escalations throughout Lebanon, no longer just in South Lebanon, just, I say just in quotations. We have the possibility of a real open-ended war in Lebanon, for me, the very real fear that Israeli provocations, violence, mass killing, destruction across Lebanon could tip the state into sectarian or domestic violence as well. We have war fronts in several countries in Yemen, Syria, Iraq. We have Jordan and Egypt facing existential threats because of the genocide in Gaza, and obviously we have the theater of war that's opened up with Iran. All of this is happening against the backdrop of an American presidential election and a complete inability from specifically Western states to sort of intervene and pull Israel back from this genocidal violence and from its intent to really take this war beyond Gaza and into a regional war. We have the Israeli leaders openly talk about wanting to change the Middle East. And I believe that the American administration, or at least members of it, are wholly committed to that. If they're not committed to it, then they're just feckless and sort of being driven by Israeli demands. And so I think it's a very troubling moment. I feel like we're on the cusp of something that could unravel very quickly and could take us into new terrain, both regionally but also on a global front. So the way that I think about this in sort of international relations terms is to think of this period as a period of punctuated disequilibrium. We've one paradigm in which we understand relations in the region has collapsed. A new paradigm is yet to emerge, and we're in this moment of extreme danger and fluidity.
Thank you for this really solid this moment clip. if you will.
Depressing as well.
Well, this is. I mean, the way you wrapped it up is very poignant and on point for me. Um, every time I ask about this moment, I'm, as we shared earlier together, I'm in disbelief about how this moment keeps repeating for more than now 380 days. Tariq, let me ask you about the first topic, and that is, a pretty wide topic. You can approach it however you like, and that is Israel. What have we learned in the past year about Israel?
Look, I think that for me, the most fundamental thing that we've learned is actually something that I said very, very soon after the genocide began and in the days immediately after October 7th, which is that the operation that Hamas carried out then has completely shattered the idea in an irreversible way that there can be safety or security for Israeli Jews in the land of Palestine without addressing the Palestinian people and their political demands. And I think we're still there. I think the genocide that we've seen unfold over the course of the past year is precisely driven by this realization that Zionism has failed, that there can be no apartheid regime that is committed to Jewish supremacy in historic Palestine in a way that's sustainable or in a way that provides security for Israeli Jews as long as Palestinians continue to exist and continue to demand their political rights. And so I think what we are seeing, and how I understand at least Israel today, is that the regime has understood that. For the longest time and for many decades, the regime managed the Palestinian issue. They were able to sustain their apartheid, and they were able to ingratiate themselves in the region. They were able to develop this image of themselves as a liberal democracy, quote unquote, that is committed to Western values in a region in the Middle East, and they have been able to sustain that despite extreme violence and brutality and lethal actions on Palestinians that have been unabated, of course, since Israel's establishment. But on October 7th, that sustainability or the illusion of that sustainability was shattered. And I think it was shattered in a way that's irreversible. So, what we have in its stead today is a regime or a political system that is essentially committed to finishing the Nakba, to going back and realizing that, well, if you can't go back into this illusion where Israeli Jews can have calm and security without addressing the Palestinian issue, then the Palestinian issue must be addressed. And of course, for them to address the Palestinian issue is to finish the Nakba and essentially carry out their genocide in the Gaza Strip. So I think what the way that I view Israel today is that we're firmly moved beyond the illusion of partition, that Palestinians can be placed behind walls, safely behind the blockade in the Gaza Strip, behind the apartheid wall in the West Bank, that they can be siloed and Israel can maintain its sovereignty from the river to the sea. We're past that. Partitions have failed. And there's a deep, resounding recognition that the only way forward is really to end the question of Palestine once and for all. Now, this is where the political establishment is at. I have to say something about society and the majority of the Israelis. I think that before October 7th, there was an ability to separate Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, quote unquote, from the Palestinians and its apartheid regime against Palestinians. What we see today is the majority of Israelis, actually by and large, the vast majority of Israelis, believing in this fascist endeavor, believing in the idea that genocide is the only way that's possible for Israelis to regain their security and to regain their safety. So, in as far as Palestinians are featuring in Israeli public consciousness, they're featuring in that context, in the context of a people that need to be pacified, that need to be put back in their place. And so, in that sense, it's also created genocidal fervor within Israeli sort of society and culture in sort of a I never speak in broad terms like that, but given the numbers and given the lack of opposition in Israel, this is by far the sort of the vast majority of Israeli citizens. So I think the only way to think of Israel today really is as a rogue state that not only carrying out a genocide, but actually showing and demonstrating what happens when a state like that, with that kind of military power and with that kind of supremacist ideals, is given free rein and is told that there is no accountability for anything that they do. It shows this shows the full the impunity on full display.
Thanks, Tariq. Let's move to, of course, the second one is, you know, difficult emotionally and otherwise. It's Gaza. Um, oh Gaza, as one says, the the area that is made up of refugees twice over, three times over, four times over, and now complete destruction. So I don't know how to even begin talking about it, but luckily you will.
Well, I'm not sure. Honestly, I think that the past year has shown that we really must revisit all of our assumptions and all of the ways that we talk about and think about not only Gaza but Palestine generally, because I think that a lot of the ways that we have dealt with our struggle and our reality have been challenged by even the possibility of this genocide. But I'll say a couple of things about Gaza. I mean, one is that historically, Gaza has been the birthplace of Palestinian resistance. And I think far preceding Hamas for many years and decades, Gaza has presented a persistent problem for Israeli colonialism and for Zionism for various reasons. But one of the key reasons being that Gaza is actually a colonial construct. It doesn't exist the way that it exists today, or it didn't exist. It doesn't exist in the way it exists today without the partitions and the formulations that Zionist settler colonialism has imposed on Palestinians. So just by its very nature, Gaza as a reality, as a geography, as a demographic, is something that has the power to break apart Zionist settler colonialism, to break apart the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine. And because of that, it has presented a severe problem for Zionism. It always has, which is why successive Israeli governments have carried out various measures, from invasions to extrajudicial executions to war to blockades and economic pacifications, in order to try to bring Gaza under control. And time and again, it has broken out of that. So I think we have to sort of put our understanding of Gaza in that context as really the core of the Palestinian struggle for liberation and for self-determination, and the source of many of iterations of the Palestinian movement. Now, because of that, and this is where I share your horror and I share your pain, because of that, Gaza has been burdened by the disproportionate use of violence by our adversary. The up before October 7th, the scale of killing, the blockade, the starvation, the intermittent wars, what the Israelis call mowing the lawn, had already exacted horrifying costs from Gaza. And after the genocide, it's impossible to ever think about Palestine or Palestinians today without taking into account the mass killing on this scale, in this speed, in this way, with this sort of sadistic impulse and driver. And so I think that the rupture that we that has started on October 7th and we've been living in since then is really one that will take time for us to grapple with and to understand. So I think it's really important to also take note of that, and to say that we haven't yet contended with the level of pain and grief that's come out of Gaza, even as we put it in that historical context as the site and the anchor of our liberation and our historic future liberation and historic resistance. There's a couple of things I also want to say. One is that we cannot understand Gaza without understanding the fact that the partitionist framework that the Israelis have put on Palestine are completely fabricated by design and also reversible. And I think that's what October 7th did. It shows that those partitions were fluid and that they are and can be challenged in a way that completely brings apart the sort of Israeli apartheid regime of placing Palestinians in different silos. When I think about Gaza today, one of the things that I really reflect on is how important it is as for us as Palestinians to overcome these partitions and to overcome these fragmentations. Gaza has been isolated for many years, and many of us don't really have experience or engagement with its people unless they have fled and have been ethnically cleansed from Palestine. And so I've been thinking a lot about the importance of reclaiming the centrality of Gaza in our work and in our thinking, of recentering Palestinians from Gaza in all of our work and in the way that we shape our future going from here, given that they are the ones that had suffered this genocide. How do we work with them and rely on them to show us the way forward, even as we shoulder a lot of their pain and their grief?
Thanks, Tareq. Let's move to the third topic. And thank you for your promptness. As I say to the people who do this on time, you're going to make it harder for others. The third topic is a dicey one, not because it is objectively dicey, as in not because it should be dicey or ought to be dicey, but it's dicey because there's controversy on it drawn out of differences in politics, not differences in international law, and that is resistance. What have we learned in the past year about the concept, notion, or right, or empirical manifestation of the term resistance?
I mean, honestly, what we've learned is a lesson that we have known for a while, which is that even though Palestinian resistance is multifaceted and varied and has taken many forms and has been long-standing for more than a century now in the face of Zionist colonization, the only form of resistance that anyone focuses on, or anyone, that members of the international community, specifically Western members of the international community, focus on, is armed resistance. And that's immediately to reify and place Palestinianness and the Palestinian resistance within a security paradigm that's focused on terrorism. And that is used and co-opted and manipulated in order to maintain Israel's so-called right to self-defense and Israel's ability to maintain its apartheid regime. But I think when we talk about resistance, we really need to break out of that. We need to think about, obviously we can talk about armed resistance and its place in international law and its strategic and tactical utility for Palestinians. I think these conversations are happening and they're important conversations to have. But we also need to break out of thinking about resistance in solely that prism that we're being funneled into and understand that actually our resistance is much broader than that. Obviously, the armed resistance, but also the popular resistance that predated that. And I want to continue to focus on Gaza. The 2018 March of Return, which was one of the longest and most sustained forms of popular mobilization by Palestinians, were popular by nature. And these were aimed at inalienable rights, specifically the right of return. That popular resistance was met with fire, with live fire that targeted medics and journalists, that killed hundreds of Palestinians and injured more than 36,000 Palestinians, many of them becoming amputees and less able bodied people because of Israeli aggression. Now, that popular resistance is something that has informed the Palestinian struggle for self-determination for close to a century. We have forms of resistance in in through economic boycotts, through pushing for the BDS, in narrative warfare, in pushing out for legal interventions in courts, whether American courts or international courts. So the way that we resist is a really actually a very rich tapestry, and I think it's all grounded in this idea of sumud, which is a steadfastness, a fastness, just a reassertion of the right of Palestinians to resist in the way that we have resisted, the carrying on with our daily lives under these brutal circumstances. All of this is a form of resistance. And I think often when we talk about resistance, it gets reduced into that very specific and very narrow way of defining resistance as armed resistance. And I think that's something that ends up serving the goals of our adversary, which is to reduce us to what they can then call as a form of terrorism. Now, specifically with relation um, to armed resistance, I'll talk about it just within the context of its strategic and tactical value. I think that Hamas specifically, because it's the only effective resistance party among the Palestinians, has really grappled with the question of armed resistance. During the Second Intifada, they employed this tactic in a way that was aimed at trying to compel the Israeli electorate to feel the pain of the occupation and compel their leaders to pull back from the occupied territories. That was really their goal of using suicide bombings throughout the years of the Second Intifada. And that failed, even by Hamas's measures. That failed because what it ended up doing was compelling the Sharon government at the time to actually invade and reoccupy in ways that were more brutal. And so Hamas went away, sort of pulled back on its armed resistance and began exploring other forms of resistance, what it called economic resistance and political resistance. They engaged in government, thinking that they can turn the Palestinian Authority into a place from which to launch a revolution. And so they experimented and showed adaptability with various forms of resistance. And that fluidity and adaptability continued actually throughout the years when the Gaza Strip was under blockade. But one of the lessons that emerged over the years from Hamas was actually that Israel only responds to force, that in certain instances, armed resistance was the only way that Israel could be compelled to negotiate with the Palestinians or to give concessions. And so I think, and we have to put October 7th within that context as well, within Hamas sort of making a strategic or tactical decision, whether rightly or wrongly, and we can debate that actually armed resistance on October 7th, carrying out that kind of offensive operation, was the only way to really challenge Israeli apartheid or to challenge the structure of domination. And so I'll end by saying that the thing that we need to bear in mind is that we need to think about resistance in an asymmetric way and it's in its full diversity. We are engaging with an adversary that's very powerful militarily and also very powerful in other means, legally, diplomatically, in terms of narrative as well. And so the way we engage with the question of resistance needs to be aware of this power imbalance and needs to be strategic and tactical in the way that it is deployed in order to serve our struggle.
This is yeah, this is a lot to think about. I'm glad that you know, established a distinction between forms of resistance. I purposely ask basically the question without without preface or without qualifying resistance. There is a lot that most people are not completely aware of, even if they know that it existed, but are not completely aware of the extent to which nonviolent resistance is ubiquitous every minute, every day for the past several decades. Um, because the idea is you can see resistance, but most of the resistance that's been happening is invisible because it is part of daily life. It's almost internal to the psyche of a human being. Just getting up and knowing that you're venturing into a world where you have no sovereignty, you pretty much have no rights. And just getting up and getting out of the house is itself is a form of resistance, and then everything flowing from there actually also as well. And that allows the dominant discourse to develop this idea that nonviolent resistance doesn't exist just because it is not as visible. So thank you for that. Let me go to the next cans of worms, because it's a lot of things. It's and you can focus on either apartheid, military occupation, settler colonialism. The overlap is staggering, and I'll let you take it from here. What have we learned in the past year about either apartheid, either and or military occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid?
Well, I mean, I think I don't know if this is something that we've learned over the past year, but I think the way that I want to address this question is by actually noting that these things are not distinct. That when we think about apartheid, we're actually thinking about settler colonialism and we're actually thinking about military occupation. And the fact that they are not distinct categories is what we should understand and bear in mind when we're thinking about our adversary. I've noticed a lot in my work, especially talking to many actually Palestinian officials before October 7th, thinking about understanding our struggle as one that's facing an apartheid regime. The pushback is often, oh, well, we don't want equality in the state of Israel. Oh, well, we don't want to give up our Palestinianness and become Israeli. And that kind of thinking is actually one that is deeply misinformed and misunderstands what apartheid is. I'm calling you today, Bassam, from South Africa, where I've been doing a lot of research. And I think it's important for us when we're understanding apartheid or when we're thinking about apartheid that we move beyond the idea that apartheid is solely about segregation and discrimination based on racial lines or identities. Apartheid is actually about demographic engineering. It's about ethnic cleansing and population transfers. It's about reshaping and remapping a certain area in order to create certain illusions in terms of demographics. So if we think about apartheid South Africa, it's the moving of Black South Africans out of their homes and out of their lands in order to create cities that are white only. And back to the second question, I think, where we talked about Gaza. Gaza is a construct precisely because of this. It's the removal of Palestinians from historic Palestine, putting them in small areas, confining them in small enclaves, what are called Bantustans, in order to create the illusion of a Jewish majority state. That kind of demographic engineering, that kind of population transfer, ethnic cleansing, that's settler colonialism, right? And that's intrinsic to apartheid. So when we think about apartheid and when we think about settler colonialism, it's important to note that these things are not distinct. The way I think about it is that Zionism as an ideology, as a racist ideology that's committed to Jewish supremacy in Palestine, employs tactics of settler colonialism. It orders its regime through a state that's an apartheid state. So that's the way that ideology manifests within the nation state model. So when we think about it in this way, we come to understand that military occupation, that apartheid, that settler colonialism, all of these things are the way that ideology manifests in Palestine. But before I end on this, I actually want to take a moment to nod to the work of Rabia Ghbariya, which is really important in this space because he's theorizing the way that these things intersect. And especially over the course of the past year, he says, we can't think of settler colonialism or genocide or apartheid. We have to understand all of these things as implicated in the Palestinian experience when it confronts Zionism, and that is our Nakba. So he's theorizing around the way that these different concepts, political concepts and legal categories intersect. And he's arguing for a new legal concept for Palestinians to think about how they intersect in a way that is obviously our Nakba, that how we theorize our experience of dispossession and erasure and genocide and colonial violence, all of those are different constituents of the Nakba. And I think this is right because it sort of moves away from thinking about these different categories as somehow distinct, and shows them to be the one adversary that Palestinians are facing.
Yes, I do appreciate the synthesis of these three and how they are not, distinct. And it's also important that people know that these could not actually happen without some measure of the other term in this apartheid, military occupation, and settler colonialism. Um, we I would really like to say more here, but I think we're gonna have to speak with you another time about other things. So I'll move to the last topic, which is nuclear in the United States, specifically. I'm assuming also in Germany and some European countries, which is Hamas. Uh, you could say anything on earth. You could insult anyone. You could really have zero limits on discourse on literally anything. But in today's atmosphere, where we or some of us live in the United States, when you mention the word Hamas, you assume that you have actually won the argument if you're speaking with somebody who is fighting on behalf of Palestinian rights, regardless of their position on Hamas, by the way. So, I would like to ask you about what we have learned about Hamas with this background that it is a the nuclear option. You talk to someone the other day, for instance, we were watching a conversation between I think Ezra Klein and or listening to
Ta-Nehisi Coates.
and yeah, Tanahasi, and then he basically was disrupting the dominant discourse, Tanahasi that is, and then he was saying something that was quite powerful, which took the host by surprise. And then the first thing the host says, "What do you think about the October 7th attacks? About Hamas?" So that is basically your secret weapon in the United States when you have very little to talk about that is connected to the empirical world. What have we learned in the past year about Hamas leadership and all, constituency and all, variance in positions about Hamas and all, including after and before October 7th?
Well, I mean, I think that for the purposes of this Palestinian context, I think I want to give an answer that's actually engaging with real questions around Hamas, and that takes as its starting point the fact that Hamas is a nationalist Islamist party, that it's a political party, and that it's a constitutive member of the Palestinian struggle for liberation, that it cannot be sort of excised from that and demonized in the way that you're describing and in the way that's dominant in the West. So I want to give more of a substantive answer, and then maybe come back to the issue of discourse and the way that this is manipulated. But just in terms of substance, I think we've learned a lot actually about Hamas in the past year, and I think it's important for us as Palestinians to reflect on that. One of the key issues here is that we've understood that Hamas, even though it was a party that has demonstrated its ability to withstand incredible military force in the form of not just Israel but American military power fighting to devastating effect against what is essentially an underground movement at this stage that's armed but not anywhere near what this adversary is. We've understood Hamas to be a very effective liberation movement. It's able to, just even in designing and executing October 7th, to really demonstrate asymmetric warfare and to have a mastery at actually driving its enemy into a war of attrition. I do think that people in anti-colonial and post-colonial studies will be thinking through and understanding and grappling with what Hamas has done in the past year for many years to come. At the same time, Hamas has shown a certain weakness, I should say, in its ability to manifest a political or strategic direction out of this military power. It has grappled with the way that it's been positioned within the Palestinian body politic, and I think it's failed to not necessarily failed. That's too strong a word. It's still in the throes of a war. Um, but I don't think it has yet managed to uh, carefully craft a way out, narrative wise, and in terms of politics, out of this paradigmatic rupture that it ushered in on October 7th. And I think it's really important for us to think about what that means in the context of a Palestinian struggle for liberation, because it's not only about Hamas. It's obviously understanding Hamas within as one party of a very diverse movement of Palestinians seeking liberation. That struggle to translate military interventions into political gains or into strategic gains, a sort of a certain weakness in terms of its ability to strategically shape the future of the struggle. I think this is something that is becoming clearer as this genocide grinds on, and we can obviously talk about why and the sort of the organizational difficulties within the movement around this, the ideological limitations perhaps around its Islamism. But all of these things are things that I think we should be grappling with when we're thinking about Hamas specifically, and when we're thinking about the Palestinian struggle in its sort of broader political and strategic goals. Now, just because you've given me the space and because of your opening around Hamas's demonization, I do want to say a couple of points about this. Look, I think that obviously, as a scholar who studied Hamas, who spent many years engaging with the movement's archives and its publications, I've met a lot of what you're describing, this sort of very reductionist approach to refusing to engage with Hamas as anything but a bloodthirsty actor, an actor that's not strategic, an actor that's particularly brutal or violent. And since October 7th, I've been met time and again with this question of, but what about October 7th? This brutality is unprecedented. And I think this is really something for us to challenge because, I'll just give an anecdotal example because it sheds some light. I was in a meeting with in an editorial room for a major American newspaper, and this person said to me, after October 7th, it's really asking a lot for Israelis to forgive what happened. How can they ever come back into a political process? And I had to sort of bite my tongue before responding and saying, actually, if anyone has to forgive, it's the Palestinians for a century of colonization. And before I was able to even begin answering, this person said, well, because the Israelis have never done anything resembling that level of violence towards Palestinians. And I think this is how we have to understand Hamas, that the kind of violence that Israelis have carried out against Palestinians, which over the century has included massacres and rape and torture and all of the brutality that we understand colonial movements to have done, all of that is always, at least from a Western gaze, seen as civilized violence. And everything that Palestinians do, even if it doesn't even come to that level of violence, will be seen as uncivilized violence, will be seen as violence that's intrinsically barbaric. And obviously, there's a long history of Orientalism and Islamophobia and racism that informs that. But the reason I'm bringing this anecdote is because it has nothing, Hamas becomes the lightning rod for this, but it's actually not about Hamas. Whatever Palestinians do, we will always be seen as more brutal or more violent or unstrategic. Part of the reason that Hamas was able to carry out October 7th was because Israelis never thought that Palestinians could effectively carry out an operation that really challenges apartheid. That misconception is steeped in racism. It's the same racism that says whatever Palestinians do will be horrifying or brutal or barbaric. That kind of language is language that is now focused on Hamas, but before Hamas, it was focused on the PLO. It's any kind of Palestinian resistance will be seen in disproportionate terms as uncivilized violence compared to the civilized violence of the colonizer.
Tariq, this is actually one of the topics that I am very much interested in. I taught courses on discourses on quote unquote terrorism. I don't like this word. I actually don't use it for the most part because it's so messy and problematic in how it has developed and been misused and weaponized. But I will ask you a very quick question about civilized violence, which I've also, addressed. Um, I see civilized violence as the term as having a cultural connotation about the civilized versus the uncivilized, and then I see the term structural violence, which is very much in at play in any colonial setting or in any setting in general, such as race relations in the United States, gender relations, what have you. I see structural violence as something that is connected to notions of power because the weaker party cannot impose structural violence on the other. Hence, the resort to the term terrorism, which actually was changed from, like a state approach vis-a-vis others to, individuals and groups approach vis-a-vis states, thanks to the coming together of the League of Nations and then the United Nations, where states determine who is a terrorist and who is not. So, structural violence and civilized violence. Is there anything you'd like to say about them and how they are similar or not, or maybe they're overlap in this case?
Absolutely. I mean, look, I think the idea of structural violence has at least in some ways informed the language of civilized violence in the sense that, structural violence, as you say, takes the forms of structures and institutions, but also enacts its violence, let's say, through air power or through drones. It's happening at a certain distance between the colonizer and the colonized, and it gives the illusion that it's cleaner. The bodies that are being killed are not necessarily seen. There isn't a direct contact between the colonizer and the colonized. I mean, if we just think about the kind of drone operations that the Obama administration did, in some ways, that's sort of seen as civilized violence because there's a distance that's placed between the colonizer and the colonized. I'm thinking specifically about a certain interview Judy Rodrin, the previous New York Times correspondent, said and did. And she said, you can October 7th, you can talk about October 7th through barbarism, and you can't call it barbaric because that's what it was. What Israel is doing today, you can say it's dispossession, you can say it's violent, but you can't use that term barbaric because it just wasn't barbaric, or it just isn't barbaric. And I think where she's going with that, obviously it's a racist mindset, but where she's going with that is that the violence of October 7th was intimate. It happened in people's homes. It happened in close combat. And I think historically that's how people separate civilized from uncivilized violence, through the structures, as you're saying. But I think part of the reason this is particularly insidious in this instance is because Zionism has practiced violence in very intimate ways. It's actually in every Palestinian home. It's against children in their beds. It's against bodies in massacres and in rapes, and it's historically done that. And so it's not just about the structure of Zionism and its ability to have sort of these institutions of violence. It's also a very intimate form, but somehow that completely gets elided. We don't think about that at all when we're thinking, what this editor tells me, Palestinians have never had to suffer that from Israelis. He's thinking only in terms of that structural violence. He doesn't see Zionism actually as one that's also very intimate and quote unquote uncivilized in the way that it's been acted about onto Palestinians. But one quick point, Bassam, if you'll allow me, I think it's really important to sort of not only focus on structure, but on this civilized, uncivilized trope, because this is how it's being enacted today. Just the past week, if I could count the number of times Harris and Biden and Netanyahu talked about Sinwar's execution as the triumph of evil, of the triumph of good versus evil, that this is a civilizational clash, that this is, the light over the darkness. The way that Israel's genocide is being narrated is as a clash of civilization versus the uncivilized. And I think this is how Zionism has long justified itself to the West.
I am, I'll just say this quickly. I am always reminded by the work of Talal Asad, who is really remarkable in addressing the question of violence and how it circulates and how it's portrayed and how it's, most importantly, categorized, and the overarching concept that he uses to explain this divergence or the double standard, the hypocrisy, or what have you, is liberalism. He looks at liberalism as the paradigm within which these categorizations are successfully made in a way that is intellectually almost unfathomable, but culturally and politically and in the real world is acceptable, including how only within liberalism are we able to justify the most destructive methods and approaches to things in order to actually bring about liberation. Like only within liberalism is this presented as and portrayed as a good thing. And that, of course, addresses both the spectacle act of quote unquote individual acts of violence, which are termed always terrorism, offset against the state violence that is structural and is usually considered, or is not even considered terrorism. Even internationally, in international law, states are actually can be sponsors of terrorism, but not actual actors that are themselves terrorists, which is why the US and others have actually called Iran a state sponsor of terrorism, not a terrorist state per se, legally speaking. So that is that. This whole conversation, I think, will become even more pronounced when the genocide subsides, because it's not going to stop. It hasn't stopped. It started before October 7th in slow motion. Before I let you go, if you can tell us, where do you think we are headed based on where we're right now? You could take any approach you like. You don't even have to, some have actually elected to approach this from a personal standpoint. So it's up to you. But where are we headed? What is next?
I might answer this from a personal standpoint. I think for me, what I've come to the realization, I think the past year, as it was for all of us, has been a year of grief and a deep sense of helplessness and a sense of being horrified and mortified by what's happening, and a certain level of urgency that we really need to get this to stop. We really need to figure out how to implement a ceasefire, how to sort of push back against the madness of what's happening. And I think that's very important, and I think we're all there still. But as you say, this genocide predates October 7th and will continue even after a ceasefire is implemented. We know this, we understand this, we've long understood this. And I think I've been starting to think a lot about how we come back into a place of developing a view that's longer than the immediate, a view that's longer than this sort of urgency of responding to colonial violence and genocide, and really trying to carve out space and time to grapple with the bigger questions, to grapple with the strategic questions. And I think we need to do that collectively as Palestinians if we are to figure out a way to come out of this. I think I say this time and again, I think Palestinians and Zionists understand that we're in an existential battle. Zionists, on their hand, for their part, they want to finish the Nakba. They want to create their Jewish supremacist state from the river to the sea. And Palestinians understand that the only way they'll achieve liberation if they completely dismantle Zionism and have a future of justice, equality, and freedom between the river and the sea. For both of these constituencies, it's an existential battle. Everyone else thinks that we can go back into an October 6th mold, but Palestinians and Zionists understand that's not the case. So for Palestinians, I think we really need to take this moment of severe rupture and grapple with what it means for us to continue to wage this struggle against a genocidal enemy. How do we come out of this moment of darkness that's darker than the Nakba? And I think that there are many things we can hold on to. The past year has shown us that Israel is not infallible. Actually, that Israel is a weak state, and without American support, it would have already been dismantled by now. We understand that Zionism as an ideology no longer has the support of most constituencies in the world, on a popular level at least. It's shown the hypocrisies, talking about liberalism since you brought that in. It showed the hypocrisies of liberalism in a way that's unprecedented, I think, Bassam. And so there's a lot of things for us to grapple with on a strategic level. And I think even as the genocide is continuing, and even as we're fighting that and meeting the urgency of the moment, I'm personally trying to also pull back and carve out space for me to grapple with these bigger questions about where we go from here in a collective way with other Palestinians. And I think that's the work that grounds me.
Thank you, Tariq, so much for joining me and sharing your views with a lot of people who are watching and listening. Hope to see you again. Stay safe and
Inshallah.
بنشوفك.
You too. عن قريب إن شاء الله. Thank you, Bassam. سلم لي كتير على نورا.
Thank you, حبيبي. Take care.
All right. Ciao, ciao.